A dark fantasy tale. In the waning days of the Fourth Age, when the great kingdoms had crumbled and the old magic had faded from the world like morning mist, there lived a man who still practiced a profession that most believed extinct. He was a monster hunter, perhaps the last of his kind, and his name was Garrick Ashwood. The trade of monster hunting had once been noble and necessary. In the days when dragons still flew and dark things crawled up from the deep places of the earth, hunters had been celebrated, welcomed in every town, and rewarded handsomely for their services. They had guild halls in every major city, apprenticeship programs, libraries filled with bestiaries and treatises on the weaknesses of various creatures. They had been heroes. But that was long ago. Now, in these diminished times, most people no longer believed in monsters. Oh, they still told stories around fires, tales of werewolves and ghouls, of vampires and demons, but these were just stories. Entertainment for children and the superstitious. The educated folk of the great cities laughed at such nonsense. Monsters, they said, were merely metaphors. The real dangers came from human cruelty, from war and plague and famine. There were no literal beasts lurking in the shadows. They were wrong, of course, but Garrick had long since stopped trying to convince them. He was 43 years old, though he looked older. His face was a map of scars. Thin white lines across his cheek from a ghoul's claws. A puckered mark on his jaw from a werewolf's bite that had nearly killed him. A burn across his temple from a fire drake's breath. His hair, once black as coal, was now liberally streaked with gray. His hands were calloused and marked with old wounds, and his body moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had been broken and healed too many times. He traveled alone, as he had for the past 7 years, ever since his last apprentice had died. The boy's name had been Thomas, barely 19, eager and brave and foolish. They had been tracking a nest of ghouls in the catacombs beneath an abandoned monastery, and Thomas had rushed ahead despite Garrick's warnings. The ghouls had torn him apart before Garrick could reach him. Garrick had killed every last ghoul in that nest, but it hadn't brought the boy back. Nothing could. And afterward, sitting in the blood-soaked darkness with Thomas's body in his arms, Garrick had made a decision. No more apprentices. He would not be responsible for another death. He would hunt alone until the hunting was done, or until he himself fell. 7 years had passed since then, and Garrick was still hunting. Still alive, though sometimes he wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. On a gray autumn morning, with rain threatening and the wind carrying the smell of distant snow, Garrick rode into the town of Millhaven. It was a modest place, perhaps 500 souls, nestled in a valley where a river ran swift and cold. The houses were timber and stone, the streets unpaved mud. A mill stood at the river's edge, its wheel turning steadily, and smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. It looked peaceful, but Garrick had learned long ago that appearances meant nothing. Evil didn't announce itself with thunderclaps and omens. It crept in quietly, wore familiar faces, hid in plain sight. He had come to Millhaven following rumors, whispers of disappearances, of livestock found drained of blood, of something seen moving in the woods at night. The rumors were vague and contradictory, as rumors always were, but they had the ring of truth to Garrick's experienced ear. Something was hunting near Millhaven, And whatever it was growing bolder. He guided his horse, a sturdy gray mare named Ash, through the muddy streets toward the inn. The sign above the door read, "The Drowning Maiden," and depicted a woman's face half submerged in water. A cheerful image for a drinking establishment. Inside, the common room was dim and smoky, warmed by a fire in the large hearth. A handful of locals sat at rough wooden tables, nursing ales and speaking in low voices that fell silent when Garrick entered. They stared at him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity that country folk always showed to strangers. Garrick was used to it. He moved to the bar, where a stout woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes was wiping down the counter. "Room for the night," he said, laying a silver coin on the bar, "and a hot meal if you've got one." The woman eyed the coin, then him. Her gaze lingered on the weapons he carried. 2 swords crossed on his back, a row of silver throwing knives on his belt, various pouches and vials attached to his leather armor. "We don't want trouble," she said flatly. "Neither do I," Garrick replied. "Just a room and a meal." She studied him a moment longer, then swept the coin off the bar with practiced efficiency. "Upstairs, second door on the left. Stews on. Ale or water?" "Water." The innkeeper, her name was Marta, she told him, brought him a bowl of mutton stew and a hunk of dark bread. The stew was surprisingly good, well seasoned and thick with vegetables. Garrick ate slowly, savoring it. One never knew when the next good meal would come. As he ate, he listened to the conversations around him. The locals had returned to their discussions, mostly ignoring him now. They talked about the weather, about crop yields, about a wedding planned for next month. Normal things, safe things. But underneath the mundane chatter, Garrick heard the currents of fear. "Hasn't been seen in 3 days now. Something took 2 of Aldrin's sheep last night, right from the pen. Tracks in the mud, but they didn't look like any animal I know." Garrick finished his stew and approached a table where 3 older men sat. They looked up at him warily. "Pardon the intrusion," he said, "but I couldn't help overhearing. You're having trouble with something taking livestock?" The men exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, a grizzled farmer with a face like weathered leather, spoke. "Maybe. Why's it your concern?" "I'm a hunter," Garrick said simply. "I deal with problems of this nature." "A hunter?" another man snorted. "What, you think it's a wolf? We can handle wolves ourselves." "I don't think it's a wolf," Garrick said. "If it was just a wolf, you wouldn't sound so worried." The 3 men fell silent. Then the grizzled farmer sighed. "Sit," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Might as well tell you, since you're asking. Name's Willem. This here's Joris and Peter." Garrick sat, and Willem continued. "Started about 2 weeks ago. Livestock going missing. Sheep, chickens, even a pig. At first we thought it was wolves, like Joris said, or maybe thieves, but then we found the carcasses." "What was wrong with them?" Garrick asked. "Drained," Willem said, his voice dropping. "Every drop of blood gone, but hardly any wounds on them. Just 2 marks on the neck. Like," he hesitated, "like something bit them and drank." Garrick felt a familiar cold settle in his gut. He knew what that meant. "And the disappearances?" he asked. Someone mentioned people going missing? The three men looked even more uncomfortable. Peter, who hadn't spoken yet, said quietly, "My daughter, Elena. She's 16. 3 nights ago, she went out to the well after dark to fetch water. Never came back. We searched all the next day, found no sign of her."
Any blood? Any signs of struggle?
Nothing. It's like she just vanished.
Garrick was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he asked, "Has anyone else gone missing?"
"Old Garth, the shepherd," Joris said. "Week before that. And before him, a traveling merchant who'd stopped for the night. People figured he'd just moved on, but his cart was still at the stable, his goods still packed. Why would he leave all that?"
3 disappearances. Livestock drained of blood. No bodies found. Garrick knew what they were dealing with.
"It's a vampire," he said. The word fell like a stone into still water. The men stared at him. Around the common room, conversations had stopped again. Everyone was listening now. "Vampires aren't real," Marta said from behind the bar, but her voice lacked conviction. "They're real," Garrick said. "Rare, but real. And you have one hunting in or near your town." "That's madness," Willem said. "Vampires are just stories." "So are monster hunters," Garrick replied. "Yet here I sit." He stood up, and every eye in the room followed him. "I'll need to examine the sites where the livestock were killed, and I'll need to know everywhere the missing people were last seen. Tomorrow, at first light, I'll begin tracking it." "And what do you expect in return?" Willem asked suspiciously. "What's this going to cost us?" "If I kill it, 50 silver, Garrick said. "If I fail, nothing. You won't need to pay the dead." That night, Garrick lay awake in his room at the inn, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the sounds of the building settling. His sword lay unsheathed beside him on the bed. He never slept unarmed. A vampire. He'd only encountered 3 in his entire career. They were intelligent, cunning, and extraordinarily dangerous. Stronger than 10 men, faster than thought, able to command the minds of the weak-willed. Silver could hurt them, decapitation could kill them, but getting close enough to do either was the challenge. And they were patient. A vampire could live for centuries, outlasting entire civilizations. What was one human hunter to a creature that had seen empires rise and fall? But for all their power, vampires had weaknesses. They couldn't abide sunlight. Running water burned them like acid. They needed permission to enter a home uninvited, and they had to return to their resting place each day before dawn, to sleep in the earth of their homeland. Find the resting place, and you could kill them while they slept, helpless in the grip of the day death. That was Garrick's only real chance. As dawn broke, gray and cold, Garrick rose and armed himself. Besides his 2 swords, one steel, one silver-plated, he checked his throwing knives, his vials of holy water, his wooden stakes, and the various other tools of his trade. He looked like a walking armory, and he'd learned long ago not to care what people thought of that. Willem met him outside the inn, along with Joris and 2 other men Garrick hadn't met, volunteers, he supposed, or perhaps just curious. They led him to the farms where livestock had been killed. The pattern was consistent. In each case, the animal had been taken from its pen or field despite secured gates and fences. No signs of forced entry. The vampire must have simply lifted the animals over the barriers, an easy feat for something with such strength. The bite marks on the recovered carcasses were distinctive. 2 puncture wounds, neat and precise, typically on the neck or inner thigh where major blood vessels ran close to the surface. The bodies were completely drained but otherwise unmarked. No signs of feeding frenzy or rage. This vampire was controlled, methodical.
"How long does it take?" Joris asked, watching Garrick examine one of the sheep carcasses. "The draining, I mean."
"Minutes," Garrick replied. "They're efficient."
"And the people it took? Are they—"
"Dead," Garrick said flatly. "Almost certainly. A vampire usually keeps its human victims alive for a while. Fresh blood is better than cold. But after 3 days—" He shook his head. "I'm sorry, but you should prepare for the worst."
The men's faces fell, but none of them looked surprised. They'd already known, deep down.
"Can you find it?" Willem asked. "Can you kill it?" "I can try," Garrick said, "but I need to know more. Has anyone seen anything unusual? Any strangers in town? Any abandoned buildings or caves nearby where something might hide during the day?"
"There's the old Thornwood Estate," Petter said slowly. "About 3 miles north of here. Been abandoned for, gods, must be 20 years now. The family that owned it died out, and no one wanted to buy the place. There were always rumors about it. Dark rumors."
"What kind of rumors?" "The old lord who lived there, Lord Thornwood, he was strange. Kept to himself, never came to town, didn't attend church. Some said he practiced dark arts. When he died, they found his body in the manor, but it was wrong somehow, withered, like he'd been dead for months, even though people had seen him just days before."
Garrick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Show me where this estate is." They walked to the edge of town, and Petter pointed north along an overgrown path that led into the forest. "Follow that trail about an hour. You'll come to the estate. Big stone house, can't miss it. But," he hesitated, "be careful. Even before all this started, people who went up there sometimes came back, changed, quiet, nervous, like they'd seen something they couldn't talk about." "I'll be careful," Garrick said. But careful only went so far when hunting monsters. He set out alone, refusing the men's offers to accompany him. They would only be liabilities in a fight, and he wouldn't be responsible for more deaths. This was his burden to bear. The path through the forest was barely visible, choked with undergrowth and fallen branches. The trees here grew dense and dark, their canopy blocking out most of the gray morning light. The forest was silent in an unnatural way. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the brush, just the sound of Garrick's footsteps and his own breathing. He walked with his hand on his sword hilt, every sense alert. After an hour of careful progress, the trees began to thin, and Garrick caught his first glimpse of the Thornwood Estate. It was a mansion of gray stone, 3 stories tall, with a tower at one corner. Once it must have been grand, but decades of neglect had taken their toll. Windows were broken, shutters hung askew, and ivy crawled up the walls like grasping fingers. The grounds around it had gone wild.
The gardens were jungles of overgrown plants. The fountain in the front courtyard was cracked and dry, and the iron gate hung open on rusted hinges. It looked dead, abandoned. But Garrick knew better than to trust appearances. The front door stood ajar, darkness beyond. Garrick paused at the threshold, considering. Vampires needed permission to enter a home, but did that apply to their own lairs? He wasn't certain. The old texts had been unclear on that point. He decided not to risk it. Instead, he began to circle the building, looking for other entrances. Vampires typically had multiple escape routes in case their resting place was discovered. Around the back of the estate, he found what he was looking for, a cellar door, set at an angle into the ground, secured with a rusted chain and padlock. The chain was old, but the padlock was new. Someone had been here recently. Garrick drew one of his silver knives and used it to pry open the lock. It gave with a sharp crack that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. He froze, listening, but no alarm was raised. Whatever dwelt in the estate either hadn't heard or didn't care. He opened the cellar door carefully, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. The smell that wafted up was unmistakable. Earth and mold and something else, something sweet and rotten that made his stomach turn. The smell of death. Garrick lit a small lantern from his pack and descended into the darkness. The cellar was large, with a low ceiling supported by stone pillars. Garrick's lantern cast dancing shadows across walls lined with empty wine racks and old crates. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor. At the far end of the cellar, he found another door, this one of heavy oak, banded with iron. It was closed but not locked. Beyond it, more steps led even deeper underground. Into the crypts, Garrick realized. Every proper estate had family crypts. He descended the second stairway, moving as quietly as he could. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of death intensified. His breath misted in the lantern light. The crypt chamber was circular, with alcoves set into the walls. Most were empty, their former occupants long since crumbled to dust. But one alcove was occupied. A coffin rested there, simple and unadorned, and lying atop it, as though displayed for viewing, were 3 bodies. Garrick forced himself to approach, to look at what the vampire had left. The bodies were pale as marble, their skin waxy and translucent. 2 men and a young woman, Elena, he presumed. Their eyes were closed, their hands folded across their chests. They looked almost peaceful, if not for the twin puncture wounds on each of their necks. They'd been drained completely and then arranged here like offerings, or perhaps trophies. Garrick felt rage kindle in his chest, the cold, focused anger that had sustained him through years of hunting. This was why he did this work. Not for the coin or the glory, but because things like this vampire existed, and someone had to stop them. He turned his attention to the coffin. This was it, the vampire's resting place. Inside that box of wood, the creature would be sleeping the day sleep, vulnerable to destruction. But it was only mid-morning. He had hours yet before sunset. He could wait, prepare, ensure he had every advantage. Or he could act now while the vampire was at its weakest.
Garrick chose action. Hesitation killed hunters.
He set down his lantern and drew both his swords, steel in his left hand, silver in his right. Then, with a deep breath, he moved to the coffin and lifted the heavy lid.
Inside lay a man, if it could still be called that. He looked to be in his 50s, with gray hair and a neat beard, dressed in fine clothes that had rotted with age. His skin was gray as ash, his lips bloodless. His hands were folded across his chest, and his fingernails had grown long and sharp as claws. Lord Thornwood, Garrick presumed, 20 years dead, yet preserved by the curse that had transformed him.
The vampire's eyes were closed, its face peaceful. In the day sleep, vampires were utterly unconscious, unable to wake or defend themselves.
Garrick raised his silver sword, positioning the point above the vampire's heart. One thrust, straight down through the ribs, and it would be finished. But as he prepared to strike, the vampire's eyes snapped open. They were red as fresh blood, and they fixed on Garrick with terrible awareness.
"Wait," the vampire said, its voice a dry whisper. "Please, wait."
Garrick didn't wait. He drove the sword down with all his strength. But impossibly, the vampire moved. Despite the day sleep, despite all the laws of its nature, it moved, rolling sideways, and the silver blade struck only the wood of the coffin, sinking deep into the base. The vampire surged up from the coffin with inhuman speed, one clawed hand catching Garrick by the throat and lifting him off his feet. The steel sword clattered from Garrick's left hand as he grasped at the iron grip, cutting off his air. "I said, wait," the vampire hissed, and slammed Garrick against the stone wall hard enough to crack ribs. Garrick's vision exploded with stars. Through the pain and the lack of air, he managed to draw one of his silver throwing knives and drive it into the vampire's forearm. The creature shrieked and released him, staggering back. Silver smoke rose from the wound, and the smell of burning meat filled the crypt. The vampire stared at the knife protruding from its arm, then slowly pulled it free. The blade clattered to the floor, stained with black blood. Garrick gasped for air, his back against the wall, watching the vampire. It should have killed him already, should have torn out his throat in a rage, but instead it stood there, cradling its wounded arm, watching him with those terrible red eyes. "You're not supposed to be able to wake during the day," Garrick said, his voice hoarse. "It's impossible." "I know," the vampire replied. "And yet, here I am. Here we are. Now will you listen, or do we continue this futile violence?" Garrick's hand moved to another knife, but he didn't draw it yet. Why should I listen to a monster? The vampire's laugh was bitter. "A monster? Yes, I suppose that's what I am now. But I wasn't always. Once I was a man, a scholar, a lord. Once I had a name and a family and a life. All of that is gone now, lost to the curse I carry. But some part of me remains, some fraction of what I was. "You've killed 3 people," Garrick said, "that I know of."
"I have," the vampire admitted, "and I will carry that guilt for eternity. But I did not choose this existence, Hunter. I did not ask to become what I am."
"No one ever does," Garrick replied. "But it doesn't matter what you were, only what you are now."
"Does it?" The vampire moved closer, and Garrick tensed, ready to fight or flee. But it only bent and picked up Garrick's fallen steel sword, handling it carefully. If you had the power to end your own cursed existence, but lacked the means, and someone finally provided that means, would you not take it?
Garrick stared at the creature, trying to understand. "You want me to kill you?"
"I want you to release me," the vampire said, and held out the sword hilt first. 20 years I have existed in this state. 20 years of fighting the hunger, of trying to resist the urge to feed. At first, I fed only on animals, on livestock. I thought I could control it, limit the damage. But the hunger grows, Hunter. Every year it grows stronger, and my will grows weaker. I knew eventually I would lose the battle. I knew I would begin to kill.
And I did. The vampire's face twisted with something like anguish. The merchant was first. I tried to take only enough to sustain myself, but the feeding frenzy took hold. I drained him completely before I realized what I'd done. Then the shepherd. Then its voice broke. Then the girl, Elena. She was so young, so innocent, and I killed her.
"Why didn't you destroy yourself?" Garrick asked. "Why not walk into the sunlight and end it?"
"I tried," the vampire said, "dozens of times, but the curse won't let me. Every time I approach the light, my body refuses to obey. The survival instinct overrides everything: reason, will, morality. I am a prisoner in my own undead flesh, forced to continue this monstrous existence against my every wish." It held out the sword again, more insistently. "So I beg you, Hunter, finish what you came here to do. End this curse. Free me from this nightmare." Garrick looked at the sword, then at the vampire. This could be a trick. Vampires were known for their cunning, their ability to manipulate. This could all be an elaborate deception to make him lower his guard. But as he looked into those red eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected to see in a monster. Genuine suffering. Genuine desperation. "If I do this," Garrick said slowly, "how do I know you won't simply overpower me again? You've already proven you can move during the day."
"A partial awakening only, and it cost me dearly," the vampire said. "I can feel the day sleep pulling at me even now. Soon I will collapse, and then I will be truly helpless until sunset. If you're going to act, do it quickly, before my will fails entirely and the beast takes over again." Garrick took the sword, and the vampire visibly relaxed. It moved back to the coffin and lay down inside, folding its hands across its chest as they had been before.
"Through the heart," it said. "That will do it. Make it quick."
Garrick stood over the coffin, sword raised, looking down at the creature that had once been Lord Thornwood, a man who had become a monster through no fault of his own, who had fought his nature for 20 years and finally lost the battle. Was there any humanity left in such a being? Any soul worth saving? Or was it already damned, and this final act of destruction a mercy? Garrick didn't know. Wasn't sure anyone could know. But he knew what had to be done. "May you find peace," he said quietly, and drove the blade down through the vampire's heart. The creature gasped, a horrible rattling sound, and its back arched. Its hands grasped at the sword blade, cutting themselves on the sharp edges. Black blood welled up around the wound, and the smell of burning filled the crypt as the silver coating on the blade did its work. "Thank you," the vampire whispered, and then it collapsed back into the coffin. The red light faded from its eyes, replaced by something almost like relief. Its body began to decay rapidly, flesh withering and crumbling, skin turning to dust. Within moments, nothing remained but bones and rotted clothes, and even those began to fall apart. In the space of a minute, Lord Thornwood was truly dead at last. His long unlife finally ended. Garrick pulled his sword free and stepped back, breathing hard. The crypt was silent now, except for his own heartbeat. He turned to the 3 bodies laid out before the coffin. They deserved better than to lie here in the dark. He would bring the townspeople to recover them, to give them proper burials. But first, he had to ensure the vampire was truly destroyed. He gathered dry wood from the broken furniture in the estate above and built a pyre in the crypt chamber. He placed the vampire's remains atop it, along with everything from the coffin, the rotted clothes, the wood itself, even the earth that had lined its base. Everything had to burn. As the flames rose and the smoke filled the chamber, Garrick climbed back up to the cellar and then out into the blessed daylight. The sun had reached its zenith, and though the day was gray and cold, Garrick had never been more grateful for its light. He made his way back to Millhaven and found Willem and the others waiting anxiously at the inn. "It's done," he said simply. "The vampire is destroyed. You'll find the bodies of the missing in the estate's crypt. I'll show you where." The relief on their faces was palpable, but it was mixed with grief. They had hoped, perhaps, that their loved ones might somehow still be alive. The confirmation of death, even expected death, was still a blow. Garrick led a party back to the estate that afternoon. They recovered the bodies and carried them back to town for burial. The town's priest performed the funeral rites, and Garrick stood at the back of the small crowd that gathered, unnoticed and apart. He always stood apart. That evening, Willem pressed a purse of coins into Garrick's hand, 50 silver, as promised, though Garrick suspected the town could ill afford it. "You saved us," Willem said. "That thing could have killed us all eventually." "Maybe," Garrick replied. "Or maybe it would have destroyed itself before then. I suppose we'll never know." He left Millhaven at dawn the next morning, before most of the town was awake. He rode north on Ash,
following rumors he'd heard of strange howls in the mountains, of travelers disappearing on the high roads. There was always another monster, another hunt. The work never ended. As he rode, Garrick thought about Lord Thornwood, about the man he had been and the monster he had become. He thought about the desperation in those red eyes, the plea for release from a cursed existence. Most monsters Garrick had killed were simple creatures, beasts driven by hunger and instinct, predators that killed because that was their nature. He felt no guilt about destroying them, any more than he would feel guilty about putting down a rabid dog. But Thornwood had been different. Thornwood had retained his humanity, or some fragment of it, even in undeath. He had fought his nature, tried to resist, and ultimately failed. And in the end, he had sought redemption through destruction. Did that make him less of a monster, or more tragic? Garrick didn't have an answer. The road ahead was long and cold, and the mountains rose gray and forbidding in the distance. Somewhere up there, something was hunting, something that needed to be stopped. The dreams were long gone now, worn away by too many hunts, too many deaths, too much darkness. But the duty remained. He was the last hunter, and as long as monsters walked the world, he would hunt them. Even if it meant one day he would fall, alone and unmourned, in some forgotten place. Even if the weight of all the lives he'd taken, monster and man alike, grew heavier with each passing year. Even if he sometimes wondered if there was really any difference between the hunter and the hunted, between the man who killed monsters and the monsters themselves. He would hunt because someone had to, because the innocent deserved protection, because evil, whatever form it took, could not be allowed to triumph. And if that made him no better than the creatures he killed, if the line between righteousness and brutality had blurred beyond recognition, well, that was a burden he would carry alone. The last hunter, walking the gray roads of a fading world, searching for monsters in the shadows. And finding them, always finding them. Because monsters were real, no matter what the people in their warm houses and safe cities believed. And as long as monsters existed, someone had to stand against them. Even if that someone was just a scarred, tired man on a gray horse, riding toward the next horror, the next fight, the next impossible choice between mercy and duty. Garrick Ashwood rode north into the mountains, and behind him the town of Millhaven slowly returned to its normal rhythms, the terror of the past weeks already beginning to fade into memory, into story, into myth. Just another tale to tell around the fire on cold nights. Just another monster slain. Just another hunter passing through. And in the forgotten crypt beneath the Thornwood Estate, the ashes of what had once been a man and then a monster cooled slowly in the darkness, and the smoke of his pyre rose through cracks in the stone to dissipate in the autumn wind. An ending of sorts, and yet not truly an ending, because the work was never finished, the hunting never done. There would always be another monster. There would always be another town in need. There would always be the road, and the next hunt, and the next impossible choice. Until the day Garrick himself fell, and there was no one left to take up the burden.
The last hunter in a world that no longer believed in monsters.
The last hunter, standing between light and darkness.
The last hunter, alone.
Always alone, but still hunting, still fighting, still moving forward into whatever horrors awaited.
Because someone had to.
And that someone was him.
The end.